loud. All right. Hello to translation students, Spanish to English translation students at the Universidad Intercontinental. We have the great pleasure of having Dr. George Henson give us an interview. Dr. Henson is a renowned Spanish to English translator of Mexican literature, of Latin America as well, but we're focusing on Mexican literature today. To date, Dr. Henson has authored around a dozen book-length translations. In 2023, I think it was 10 or 11, but it's 2025 now. And I think, George, you have another book coming out soon. So anyway, Mexican authors who Dr. Henson has translated include Sergio Pitol, Alberto Chimal, Luis Jorge Boone, and Elena Poniatowska. He's also translated Latin American authors like Abel Pose. His translation of Jose's A Long Day in Venice, or that's the book title in English, obviously, was long listed for the 2023 Queen Sofia Spanish Institute Translation Prize. Dr. Henson is a regular contributor to World Literature Today. He was a Tulsa Art Fellow from 2022 to 2023. He currently teaches translation at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, holds a master's degree in Spanish from Middlebury College and a PhD in literary studies from the University of Texas at Dallas. And just on a personal note, Dr. Henson is a dear colleague and friend. So thank you so much, George, for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
I'm happy to be here, and thank you for making me sound much more important than I am.
Well, you are very, very important. You're being modest, I think. So why don't we just dive right in? How did you get into literary translation and into the translation of Mexican literature specifically?
It's kind of an interesting road that I took. I did my first literary translation as an undergrad, and this was many, many moons ago. To your students, that's a very common, well, maybe not a common English idiom, but certainly during my generation, to say that something was many moons ago says it was a long time ago. So I took an independent study and did some literary translation, and then I didn't do anything for a very long time. And then when I started my PhD about 16 or 17 years ago, I was at the University of Texas at Dallas, and they had the Center for Translation Studies. So I just happened to be at this school that had a nationally renowned translation program. So I decided to take a workshop on literary translation. And so that was about 16 years ago. And so I've slowly started doing more and more translation. And one of the first things I published, there's an American literary magazine called Nimrod, International Journal of something, and they were doing a Mexico issue. So it's very common in the United States for literary magazines to do an issue that is devoted to a specific country. And so they were doing a Mexico issue, and I thought, oh, I want to publish something in Nimrod. And so I consulted with one of my professors, and he said, why don't you try to get something by Elena Poniatowska? So talk about starting at the top.
Yeah.
So I contacted who I thought was Elena's agent, and I got an email back and said, I'm not Elena's agent anymore, but I passed your email on to her. And Elena emailed me. Now, so this was 15 years ago. And she says, I hear you want to translate one of my stories. So she had a collection called in Spanish, La Pederia. And I just wanted to translate one story for this Mexico issue. And so I translated it. And of course, it got accepted because it was Elena Poniatowska. How is a literary magazine, going to turn down anything by Lena Poniatowska. And that was
Yeah.
my very first translations. And
Wow.
from there, she's like, well, would you like to translate the rest of the stories? And so I don't remember, there may be 10 or 12 short stories in this collection. So I translated all of them and found a publisher for it. So as I said, I mean, I started at the top.
Mm.
And notice that I call her Elena now. And we have become very good friends. She has been so kind to me. Every time I go to Mexico, she invites me to her home. And in fact, now I go to Mexico sometimes just to see her.
Mm.
Um, so that's kind of how I got started, and certainly in Mexican, in translating Mexican literature.
I have her book here that you're talking about. I tried to order the translation that you did too. I didn't receive it in time. But
Hold on,
that's what
I think you get yours and I'll get mine.
yeah, that's what I was looking for when I was looking to the side. Yeah, this is,
So that's yours is
oh,
the
is it gonna
Spanish,
show?
right?
Yep,
La Peridia.
yep,
And this is my translation. So as you notice, and as you notice, the title is different.
yeah.
Um, a Tlaperia is not a hardware store. And Elena told me, you're not going to call it hardware store because there are hardware stores and then there are Tlaperias, which are kind of like hardware stores, but they sell more things that hardware stores don't sell. So Tlaperia is one of the short stories in the collection. And usually in a short story collection, one of the short story titles becomes the title of the collection. It's called the
Mm,
title story. So we
yeah.
just took another short story, The Heart of the Artichoke.
Interesting.
So we made The Heart of the Artichoke the title story.
Okay. Very interesting.
And
Uh,
this was published, 13 years ago now.
yeah, because one of the things I did wonder too, I think you had her book, and then there was one by Jorge or Luis Jorge Boone that were about the same time. I couldn't distinguish which came out first.
Uh, it, Elena's came out first, and then the publisher of Elena's book found Luis Jorge Boone, who now has become a rather important Mexican writer. And he said, would you like to translate this short story collection by Luis Jorge Boone? And he was relatively unknown and then. Now he's married to Fernanda Melchor. So some of your students may know who Fernanda Melchor is. And that's kind of actually made him a little more famous because he's married to Fernanda. I shouldn't say that. He's an excellent writer. He's a poet as well as a novelist. So he's a very multifaceted writer. But to date, my translation of The Cannibal Night, which was a collection of short stories, is the only book-length translation of his that's been done. Some other
Huh.
things, some other shorter pieces of his have been translated, but my book still remains the only book of his work that has been translated, and he deserves to be translated. And we can talk about that later, about all of the intricacies of finding someone to translate.
Mm.
Um, so Luis Jorge Boons, and I call him, because his name is Luis Jorge. My name is George. People call me Jorge, so we call each other Tocayo. Um, um, so Elena's book and his book were published like within a year of each other by the same
Mm.
publisher.
Congratulations. What an excellent way to get your start in literary translation. So, in general, what does a literary translator of Mexican literature working into US English need to know to carry out literary translation? What would you say are the prerequisites?
Well, it's essentially the prerequisites for doing any translation. You have to know the market in Mexico, who is writing what. In the United States, only 3% of the books that are published are
Mm.
books in translation. So there's a very
Wow.
small slice of the pie. So all translators from all languages are competing for a very small slice of the pie. And so you need to know who is hot in Mexico,
Mm.
um, because no one is going to want to publish a translation of someone who isn't selling in their own country.
Mm.
And in publishing in general, publishers are always chasing the next great writer, right? And that usually means, but not always, that usually means young writers. So it's
Mm.
not impossible for a young writer to get their first book published, but that's kind of unusual. But if there's a lot of hype around a Mexican author, you want to be on top of that. Um, because if they're not marketable in Mexico, they're probably not going to be marketable in the United States.
Mm.
Um, so you have to know what's going on in the publishing market in Mexico. I've been very lucky because, as I said, I started with Elena Poniatowska. Then I moved to Sergio Pitol. Both of these writers from the same generation, great writers, both Cervantes Prize winners. So I, in the beginning, really did not have to follow the advice that I'm giving your students right now. I mean,
Yeah.
although Elena obviously had been translated, Sergio Pitol had never been translated to English, which no one
Mm.
could understand. How has this great writer not been translated? Right now, I'm translating a very young writer. His name is Cristian Lagunas.
Mm.
Um, he only has, I think, one novel, maybe two. His most recent novel is called El lado izquierdo del sol, the left side of the sun. Um, and so I haven't translated anyone that new. I mean, he's an emerging novelist, but he's gotten a lot of praise from Fernanda Melchor. Um, and so I'm hoping that he's going to be able to break through in the American market. Secondly, however, you have to know Mexican Spanish.
Mm.
Unfortunately, there is this belief among some translators that a good translator can translate anything.
Mm.
I don't think that's true. Um, depending upon to what extent the book relies on idiomatic language, metaphorical language, figurative language. Um, if you don't know Mexican Spanish, you're going to have a hard time. Now, there are people who translate from countries where they really aren't that familiar with the dialect, and they get published anyway. But I really suggest that the language. I mean, Mexico is the country that I've traveled to the most. I
Mm.
lived in Spain for a year. I've traveled to Cuba, believe it or not, a dozen times, and I've translated some Cuban writers. But Mexico is the country I know best. It is the
Mm.
dialect that I know best, and it is the literature that I know best. Um, but so that your students also realize, generally we say that you should translate into your A language. Do they know this
Yeah.
terminology?
Yeah, I think so.
So your A language is generally considered to be your native language. So I translate into English. English is my A language. Um, but there are some translators who are beginning to break that mold or that
Mm.
paradigm. There are people now who are translating into their B language. So if English is the B language for your students, they can reach the point into where they are able to translate into English. So don't let that, that's not a hard and fast rule. Don't
Yeah.
let that dissuade you from wanting to translate Mexican authors into English.
I think there's the opportunity too for some collaboration there, because if you get a translator who is a native speaker of Mexican Spanish, where they would really understand the nuance of the language, and you pair them with a editor of who's native in English for the United States, I think they're,
I
yeah.
think that's actually an excellent idea because I do rely on native Spanish speakers, um, native Mexican Spanish speakers a great deal. I work a lot with Alberto Chimal, and I think probably most, if not all, of your students know who Alberto Chimal is. He's very, very popular. Um, Alberto, I've translated one of his books, but dozens of his short stories.
Okay.
But I can contact Alberto if I'm working on it. I mean, when I was translating Pitol, I was not able to collaborate with Pitol for two reasons. One, he had a neurological disorder that kept him, he was losing language. And then unfortunately he died while I was translating him.
Hmm.
But Alberto knew his work very well. And so I could contact Alberto and he was very gracious and asked questions. I remember once I sent him an email and I said, "What is Pitol doing here?" And he wrote me back and he goes, "Ay, pinche Pitol." And that was to say, he's doing something really complicated here. And I
Ah,
understand why you can't understand it because I barely understand it.
yeah,
But and it's very common now for even uh, two English translators to collaborate, and usually one of them is a more seasoned translator, and the other one is a student or emerging translator. But I think
yeah.
it'd be great to collaborate with a native Mexican Spanish speaker.
Very cool. Speaking of Sergio Pitol, in books like The Love Parade and Taming the Divine Heron, you leave some words in Spanish, like señor, usted. I wondered if you're aiming for a foreignizing effect in translation, who do you imagine to be the audience of your translations if you are going for a foreignizing effect, and if you are sort of leaving words in Spanish? Do you think people are just going to recognize those words? And do you agree with, there's a literary critic, sorry, if you're ready to answer. There's a literary critic who said that, who classified your style of translation as remaining close to the source text. Do you agree with that, that characterization of your work?
Okay, well, let me begin with the last question. That was actually
Yeah.
a translator. Her name was Natasha Wimmer.
Hmm.
And she's probably one of the top Spanish to English translators today.
Hmm.
Um, so, and that she wrote that in the New York Review of Books. So at least I was in the New York Review of Books.
Yeah.
And she said that my translations, that you're right. She said they follow too close to the source text, and that was at times distracting. I consider that a compliment.
Yeah.
Um, you know, um, Nabokov, the famous Russian American author, first Russian, then he moved to the United States. He wrote in Russian, then he switched to English. Um, he said the best word for word translation was better than the best free translation.
Hmm.
Now, that's not to say that I'm word for word, but I think it depends very heavily on who you're translating. I believe that an author's style or the way they form sentences, such as Sergio Pitol, for example, I believe their syntax is part of the style. So I try to be as faithful, and that's a very slippery term. What does
Yeah.
faithful mean? I try to be as faithful to the style as possible. But what I'm also trying to do is show people that the English language is much more flexible than we think it is. There's this
Hmm.
belief that English syntax has to be subject, verb, object, right? Spanish can be highly subordinated, and there are some writers that are more subordinated than others. Sergio Pitol writes these very long, labyrinthine sentences with lots of subordination. And I think if you're careful, I believe in taking a scalpel to the syntax rather than an axe or a butcher knife, right? So yes, you have to make some changes, but I try to leave as much of the syntax alone as possible. So I'm not at all concerned about her criticism. In fact, I welcome it. Now, as far as the other questions about foreignization, yes, I believe very much in foreignization. I
Mm,
want my readers to know that they're reading a translation. For decades, traditionally, publishers did not want their readers to know that they were reading a translation because the reading public is kind of xenophobic, especially in the United States. They hate
yeah.
anything foreign. They don't like to watch foreign movies. If they know a book is a translation, they're not even going to pick it up and buy it, right?
Mm,
So they went to great lengths to hide the fact. And this is where Venuti's concept of the invisibility of the translator. They want the translator to be invisible. So then to do that, you have to remove every trace of foreignness from your text. No,
mm,
I want my readers to know that they're reading a translation. So I try to let as many foreign elements come through as possible. And in one way to do that is by leaving words in Spanish. Now, you mentioned, for example, señor. I leave all of these, what are called titles or gentilics, like señor, señora, señorita. I leave those all in Spanish because what I'm envisioning is, what if this Spanish speaker were speaking English? It would
mm,
not be uncommon to say, hello, señorita, how are you doing today?
yeah.
Right? Of course, yeah, they may also say, hello, miss, how are you doing? But it's not that unusual. So again, I'm trying to imagine this elusive Spanish speaker who's actually speaking in English.
Mm,
Now, sometimes it's a word that you think will be completely recognizable, or it may be a word that the reader can figure out from the context. So you have to be selective about how you do it. I leave, for example, the names of streets, avenues. So, I mean, obviously, I would leave Paseo de la Reforma as Paseo de la Reforma. But if it's a street in Colonia Roma that's next to the Parque Rio de Janeiro, I will say I'll say Calle Orizaba, which is next to the Parque Rio de Janeiro in Colonia Roma. I'm not going to say Orizaba Street in Rio de Janeiro Park in the Roma neighborhood. Now, there
yeah.
are translators who will do that, but I don't do that. Uh, so there's kind of not a one size fits all. You have to make judgments about how to do it, but that certainly is my approach. As far as my audience, I believe that you shouldn't write for an audience because you never know who's going to read your book.
Mm,
So there does tend to be now in the United States, Latin American literature, some people are saying, is experiencing a new boom. And so the translation of Latin American literature has a very specific audience in the United States. So you know who is probably going to tend to buy these translations. But I want anyone who picks up my translation to enjoy reading it.
they are very enjoyable reads.
Well,
Uh,
thank you.
yeah, and I guess I wouldn't think that you stick too close to the source. In my opinion, um, I haven't read all of the work that, the Spanish version of all of the books that you've translated, but it's a pleasurable experience reading your translations. What are some of the specific challenges in terms of grammar, morphosyntax, and pragmatics that you tend to encounter in Spanish to English translation?
Well, as I've already mentioned, Spanish syntax can be very different than English syntax. As I said, Spanish sentences tend to be longer. They don't have to be longer, but they're much more subordinated. English doesn't like all this subordination. They don't. But anytime anyone says, "Oh, you've got to keep the sentences short," I say, "Have you read Faulkner?" Faulkner has sentences that are several pages long. Now, of course,
Wow.
that's an exception, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But I insist that English can do more than we think it can do.
Hmm.
But I don't want to break the rules, but I want to push them as far as I can. You don't want to lose your reader, right? And and that's the reason why sometimes you have to reorder a sentence. Like, so the sentence, no matter how long it is, the reader has to be able to follow it, right?
Hmm.
As long as your reader can follow your sentence and you give them places where they can stop and take a breath before they continue, then you're fine. Spanish grammar is Spanish grammar. It's much more complex than English grammar. And so there are certain things that you do have to simplify. Spanish uses the subjunctive, for example. There are very few ways that you can bring the subjunctive through in English. In some cases, you have to re-grammaticalize or recategorize. And so you move from a conjugated verb and a subjunctive to an infinitive, for example.
Hmm.
So you have to be aware of these places where you do have to make changes, because in the end, the translation still needs to be fluent. I don't mind a little clunkiness every once in a while, but it can't be clunky. It can't be awkward the entire time. Now, as far as pragmatics, I mean, figurative language, generally, this is the area in which you have to work in equivalences, right? So if you have a metaphor or a fixed expression, an idiomatic expression, then generally you have to go with the English equivalent, but not always. If it is a metaphor that's original, for example, and Pitol does this a lot, I will ask myself, will this metaphor work if I translate it literally? And sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't. But metaphorical language is where the beauty, I mean, that's
Hmm.
what makes literature literature. Otherwise, you're translating a scientific document, right? Or a business document. It's the figurative language. It's the metaphorical language that makes literature literature. And that to me becomes the most challenging.
I think pragmatics is my favorite thing to talk about when it comes to translation too, because it's what's being said underneath the actual words that are on the page. Like there's the implications of what people are saying that you have to be able to convey too, that I just find really, really interesting.
Right. So, that, a word can have a denotation and a connotation. And denotation is generally very obvious, but one of the things that you have to train, and it's really a question of becoming trained in what the connotative meaning of something, what work, this is the verb that I always like to use. What work is this word doing? What work is this
Mm,
phrase doing? And
that's a
yes,
great way to put it.
there is something beneath the literal level, beneath the denotation,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And unfortunately, I mean, there are translators, and I wouldn't say most translators, but there are translators who don't know necessarily, if they don't know the dialect very well. This is one, again, we can't translate everything. I've turned down jobs because I just decide, I'm not going to be able to translate that. I was offered a book by Andres Neumann, one of his first books that was translated, and I turned it down, and then it was translated and became a hit, and it was such a beautiful translation. I
Mm,
mean, at the moment, I didn't turn it down because I didn't think I would be able to do it. I was working on something by Elena at the time, and I thought I just don't have the time to do this. But it was such a beautiful translation. When I read it, I said to myself, I would not have been able to do this. I would
mm,
not have been able to do it justice. So I'm glad that this other translator did it. But there is so much nuance in figurative language. As you said, what's being said here, right? These
mm.
these are the words, but what's really being said here, right? And that's where in figurative language and metaphorical language and cuss words,
Hmm.
that those can be very hard to understand. Like, really, what's going on with pinche here, right?
Mm.
Pinche can't be translated the same way each time, right?
Yeah.
What's the difference, excuse me, what's the difference between saying no manches and no mames,
Mm.
right? What's going on with the word way, right? There's no one way to translate the word way, right? And if you're not, if you haven't been out in the streets listening to the way people speak, you can read all the literature in the world. But when you hear someone using this language is when you really begin to appreciate the nuance to it. Elena
Yeah.
has told me on more than one occasion she learned to speak Spanish in the streets. Elena, when she arrived in Mexico when she was 9 years old, did not speak a word of Spanish. The family
Mm.
language was French. She learned Spanish from her nanny,
Mm.
was an indigena, right? She learned Spanish from the other servants in the house who spoke a very specific kind of Spanish. She learned Spanish in the streets. And that's why now Elena, 80 something years later, her books are rich in mexicanismos, in
Mm.
in Mexican idiomatic expressions. I'm sorry, I can just go on and go.
No, it's wonderful. Something I was thinking when you were talking earlier as well is that it seems like you think an awful lot about the reader when you're translating. And for the pragmatic piece too, if we think about, okay, I love that question, what work is this verb doing or what work is this sentence doing? Because you still want it to be fun for the reader, right? Like if
Right.
you just translate it directly and give all of that connotation away without letting the person who's reading arrive to that interpretation on their own, you're taking some of the fun out of the experience too. So it just sounds like you think a lot about the readers.
Well, I do, and I think you obviously have to. We talk about the notion of fidelity, which is a very slippery concept. What does that even mean? I mean, you have to be faithful in some way to the text. You have to be faithful in some way to the language, to the culture, but also to the reader. What was the experience the Mexican reader got out of this book?
Mm,
And what would be an equivalent experience that the American reader gets out of the book? You want them to feel the same emotion. You want them to have the same reaction. And so you ask yourself, what is it that's going to recreate this same experience, this same reading experience in English that it creates in the original text, in the source text? Um, the one book by Alberto Chimal that I have translated, um, in Spanish, it's called Los Esclavos, but we titled
mm,
it The Most Fragile Objects in English. And we can talk about why I made that choice in a minute. But it's written almost entirely in conversational Spanish, or there's lots of colloquial Spanish, I mean, there's lots of dialogue. And these are just these are everyday Mexicans from the streets who are using the kind of language you will hear, right? And so there are lots of cuss words in it. And so what am I going to do with this? I don't want people to think I mean, I could say, okay, I could translate words as fuck, right?
Yeah.
But the the vulgar language in this novel was part of the novel, and it was, in fact, I wrote in my translator's note, this book was not written in Spanish, it was written in Mexican.
Mm.
And I mean that with total respect. So what I decided to do was leave as many of these terms as possible, in some instances, almost complete sentences, but short sentences in Spanish. I created a glossary, but
Yeah.
rather than putting it at the end of the book, I put it at the beginning. So the reader, I invited them to read the glossary and told them um, they were going to become participants in this novel. So learn these expressions because you're going to see them in the text. Because I didn't,
That's
because
wonderful.
otherwise it would have, it's like, cuss words are usually one of the first things that people learn. But they don't learn how to, they overuse them in the foreign language because they don't have the same meaning. They don't understand the nuance. And sometimes when I hear one of my students use a cuss word, not in class, but outside of class, I'm like, oh, you don't know what that word means.
Yeah.
You don't use it the way you're using it. I mean, even in class recently, can I say this?
Yeah.
In my literary translation class that I'm teaching, so I teach a multilingual literary translation, so they can be translating from any language into English. So this Chinese student was saying, motherfucker, motherfucker, motherfucker. And I'm like, she
Mm.
said it with such calmness, such matter of factness. The reason she was able to say that word is because she didn't understand how
Yeah.
strong that word is,
Yeah.
right? Um, so I think, if the text says um, something like hijo de puta, right? I mean, I could translate that as motherfucker, right? Excuse me again, but or son of a bitch, right?
Yeah.
But that expression, hijo de puta, has meaning in Spanish, and I wanted to leave that meaning intact. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think probably swear words are an area where it's the hardest to find a good equivalent because
It is.
there's so much going on there. There's so much contextual meaning that you have to take into account.
There is, exactly. Exactly. And anything having to do with the word chingar, and it's hundreds of variations. Octavio Paz, in his 1940 something essay, and it's a book length essay called El laberinto de la soledad, the labyrinth of solitude. He has a chapter where he dedicates to chingar in all of its variations. And he says there is no word that symbolizes Mexico more than this word.
Mm,
How can you render that in English?
yeah. I haven't read that chapter yet, but I have the book. It's sitting on my shelf back there and on
Read
my
it.
to read list. I even think about I was doing like subtitling work from Spain to the United States, where it was this TV show where like this 16-year-old boy was in his house with his parents, and he kept saying joder, 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 joder. And the translator translated, or I think might have been automatic machine translation that I was then post editing. It was just fuck, 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 fuck. And I'm like, in the United States, there is no way that a 16-year-old boy is going to get away with saying the F word to his parents over and over and over again. So you might be able to say the literal meaning of this word is this, but suddenly when you start using it in different contexts, it just doesn't make sense.
Right. Well, first of all, the Spaniards love to cuss, but they have their own cussing. They like to use the word coño, for example. And coño, I mean, the king of Spain was recorded speaking, I think, to Hugo Chavez saying Coño, ¿por qué no te callas?
Yeah, yeah. It's a
And
great
so
quote.
the king of Spain can use coño in front of the cameras, right?
Yeah,
But you're right. These are words that, yes, people in the United States say fuck, right? But a 16-year-old doesn't say it in front of his parents, right?
yeah,
So what do you do with that? That's the big question.
yeah. So as long as you brought up Alberto Chimal and the book, The Most Fragile Objects, maybe we can talk about that a little bit. It's a very heavy topics in the book. It's
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
sexual slavery. But when I read both books, it's such a fast pace. It's like really light. The language itself felt really light. And so I wondered how you, like, what do you think of that contradiction between the heaviness of the topics and the lightness of the writing? How did you go about maintaining the pace? Um,
Well,
yeah.
so this is to some extent an examination of sexual slavery, but it's not pondering sexual slavery. It's not musing on sexual slavery. It's talking about that this exists. And so this is a book in which there's much more narration. So it
Mm,
doesn't go into philosophizing, or talking about the problems of sexual slavery. It's here are two characters that are in situations of sexual slavery, and this is what is happening to them. So the narration is this happens, this happens, this happens, but it's also very matter of fact. And that's
mm,
intentional. It's matter of fact to say these are things that are going on that the average person could not possibly believe, but they're going on in a house next door to you, right? This daughter is being held as a sexual slave by her mother and forced to do pornographic movies as if como si nada, right? And
mm,
so and here's a middle-aged man who's married who leaves his wife and becomes the sexual slave of a rich young Mexican. Um, and these are the things that happen in his everyday life. So it's like, okay, while this everyday life is going on for other people, the everyday lives of these two sexual slaves is routine. So
mm,
he's using a narrative form in which it's just talking about these things matter of factly. But at the same time, he wants you to think about, oh my God, look at these things that are going on. But these are more about um, the power that
mm,
people have over other power, right? Which is something that exists in Mexico. There's violence in Mexico, right? There are people who are powerless and there are people who are powerful. This is another example of where there are people who are powerless and then people who have power over them. So he's forcing you to look at another aspect of Mexican culture that you otherwise wouldn't think about. And if you think about, you know, all of the violence in Mexico that you read about. I mean, I read Aristiegui every day, and it's like, oh my God, another mayor was murdered, another
mm.
reporter was murdered, another girlfriend was murdered by her boyfriend, or wife was murdered by her husband. And not that none of this doesn't happen elsewhere, but this everyday violence that people now just kind of, it happens so much they've become insensitive,
Mm.
desensitized towards it. And so that's kind of what he's talking about.
I wonder what you think of the ending of that book, because it had me thinking for quite a while, where finally this man who had become a sexual slave is freed. And his first thought is that he's going to find his captor and like prove him wrong or something like that, or like yell until he gets his attention again. I thought it was very metaphorical for sort of this element of the I don't know, human experience. And I hesitate sometimes to talk in general terms about the human experience because we each have our own experiences. And like, I should only be talking about my experience. But it's interesting. I could relate to that in that people who have hurt me, you have these fantasies of confronting them and making them acknowledge how they've hurt you or things like that. And I don't know, what did you think of that?
Well, so in this case, this is a man who chose to be in the situation he was in. So the young girl who is being held, as a sex slave, forced to make pornographic movies by her mother, is in a situation she did not choose.
Mm,
Um, the man absolutely chose the situation. So on the one hand, you could think of him as kind of having the Stockholm syndrome, where he identifies
mm,
with his captor, or the battered wife syndrome, right? Who doesn't want to admit that their husband was at fault. They believe they were at the fault and not
mm.
the abuser. So to some extent, there is that going on. But I think he wants to contrast the man with the young girl, right? So that
Okay.
even though they appear to be similar situations, they really aren't that similar. Yes, they involve sexual slavery, but it's one person who has chosen. Now, I don't think he wants to say there are people who choose to be abused. I don't think that he's saying that. But I mean, there is something about the universal condition going on here, right? And I appreciate that you want to be careful, because you do have to be careful and say, well, these things are
Mm,
universal, right?
yeah.
But it is very interesting. I mean, I'm impressed that you focused on that, and that you're wondering about why he chose to write that ending for that character.
Mm,
Um, and I don't want to make an argument for Alberto that I don't know to be true. I think he's trying to say that there are people who, I mean, he's like, why did this man, this middle-aged man who had a wife and he was also a father, why did he want to be a slave? Well, in the United States, because this is an S&M situation, not, did I say in the United States? Worldwide, right? There are these situations, these S&M situations where people want to be the slave and people want to be the master. And their sexuality, what turns them on, what excites them, is so intricately linked to these roles. And there he's talking about roles, right? That they're incapable of escaping them.
mm. Let's talk a little bit about the divine heron,
Taming the
uh,
divine
or
heron.
taming the divine heron. So that one too, it's really interesting that, uh, yes, taming the divine heron. Were there examples of like vocabulary or metaphors in that book that you found challenging, exciting? The book title was an idiom that you talk about in your translator's note. You and I had a conversation as well at one point about all of the references to excrement, to just shit in the book too, and how that
Yeah.
was kind of a fun aspect of the
Um, well,
translation.
let's start with the title. This is an idiom. This relies on a Mexican idiom. It exists in other Spanish-speaking countries, but in Mexico more than any other. This creerse la divina garza, which is usually used to refer to women. Um, who is the famous Mexican actress? I can't remember her name, from the Golden Age, the one with the black hair. What is her name? I can never remember her name. She was, and I mentioned this actually in the translator's note. She was
Huh.
asked, ¿Es verdad que usted se cree la divina garza? Yo no me creo. Yo soy la divina garza. Um, that that idiom is so central to this novel. I could not imagine giving it up. So that's
Hmm.
why I wrote a translator's note explaining the importance of the idiom, because I wanted the readers thereafter, when they encounter it, to understand it. This book has been translated into several languages, and no one maintains
Interesting.
the idiom. So, I mean, I thought it has to be called that. It absolutely has to be called that. Now, Pitol was fascinated by the Russian theorist Bakhtin, and Bakhtin wrote a lot about scatological, about scatology, about
Mm.
shit, right? He wrote about what was called the carnivalesque, and part of that were human bodily functions. We call that what, bathroom humor, and when people tell bathroom jokes, we consider it to be crude. One of Pitol's goals was to desacralize the
Mm.
sacred, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But along with Monsiváis, Carlos Monsiváis, and they were intimate friends. They believed that literature had become too serious and formal and sacred in Mexico. So as young people in the 1950s, the 1960s, they were part of what was called the mid-century generation, which Elena Poniatowska was also a member of, along with Jose Emilio Pacheco. They were going to take this really serious language and turn it on its head. And that's
Mm.
what the carnivalesque does, right? And so, and so he has three novels, which he calls the Carnival Triptych, and they begin with, oh my gosh, I can't remember my own books. The Love Parade,
Yeah.
Divine Hair. So here's the Love Parade.
I'll
If
show
you
mine
look,
too.
oh yeah, if you look closely, and if in Mexico City, you might recognize that as the Casa de las Brujas, or the Edificio Rio de Janeiro in Colonia Roma Norte, by the Parque Rio de Janeiro. And then the third is called Married Life, and that's actually coming out in November, I think.
Yay.
Oh yeah,
Yay.
I turned it in 2 years ago, and they're finally getting around to publishing it. Well,
Congratulations.
thank you.
Yeah.
So the scatological appears throughout these novels, but he presents them as if it was the most normal thing in the world. In the Love Parade, for example, he has these two figures who are sitting at a party they're taking Spanish like axioms or proverbs, and they're just changing one word in the proverb and making it refer somehow to excrement. And to be honest, I can't remember any of the Spanish, but if there's a word that sounds like that, they just change one word and make it pedo. They love talking about farts.
Yeah,
And so they're sitting and they're having like this contest to see who could take these proverbs or these axioms, change one letter and make it refer to shit. So I had to come up with English equivalents. So one of the ones I came up with, there's the idiom like father, like son. De tal palo, tal astilla, right? So like father became like farter,
yeah.
like son. Anyway, that was a lot of fun. And Taming the Divine Heron, the protagonist is telling this story about when he traveled to Turkey, and I was going to say Constantinople, but oh my, Istanbul. So he's telling this story
Mm.
about having met this woman who thinks she is the divine heron, quien se cree la divina garza, and his goal is to domarla. So
Mm.
hence the title, Domar a la divina garza. So as he's telling this story, he's working himself up. In the story that he's telling, he gets worked up as well. So he's in Istanbul telling the story, and he shits himself. He's telling this story in Mexico about what happened in Istanbul. And just like in Istanbul, he shits himself in Mexico. So he shits himself as he's talking about shitting himself. But this takes place over several chapters. I can't think of any exact idioms. I mean, Pitol loves to use idiomatic language, right? And there were things I didn't understand. Uh, and so I will tell your students, every translator, uh, in addition to computerized resources,
Mm,
they also have to have human resources. And your human resources are people that you can talk to and say, hey, can you help me figure this out?
yeah,
Just like, for example, you have to know to trust your online resources. You can't just Google something, and you have to be able to trust the websites that you go to, the parallel text, etc. You have to be able to trust your human resources. So there are moments when I was like, oh gosh, I don't know what's going on here. I need someone to help me.
yeah.
Um, so I wish I could think right now of some more concrete examples.
I want to go back through the Love Parade now and look for those metaphors that you were talking about, where you had to creatively think of equivalents. That book, too, had so many historical references. Like, I learned a lot about Mexican history by reading a specific, because it's the 1930s, right? That it's focusing on.
Well, no, so late 30s, early 40s. It's this period before and during the beginning of World War II. There was a lot of Nazi infiltration into Mexico because in the beginning, Mexico remained neutral. So um, the Nazis sent hundreds of spies to Mexico, and there were
Mm,
lots of Mexican citizens who um, were favorable to the Nazis, who shared the beliefs and the goals of Nazism, of fascism. So there were networks of spies and collaborators, and it all takes place around this edificio, Rio de Janeiro, and there's a murder there. And so
yeah.
in the 70s, this man who lived there as a child goes back to try to. So it's a detective novel. So he goes back to try to solve this murder and figure out how this young boy was murdered. And so he has to find all of these people who lived there 30 plus years earlier and interview them so he could, because he becomes a historian, right? And he's a historian of this particular moment in Mexican history. And yeah, I had to do lots and lots of research.
I bet. I'm curious too, kind of bridging the discussion of the historical references in the Love Parade to uh, Pitol's trilogy of memory. It seems like you have an interest in autobiographical literature. You did Sergio Pitol's trilogy of memory. That's got the three books: The Art of Flight, The Journey, and The Magician of Vienna. And then also Abel uh Posey. I
Jose,
don't know where to
Abel
put the
Jose's,
accent.
right.
Yeah, but you did his book about Venice too.
Yeah, A Long Day
Uh
in Venice,
A Long Day in Venice. So
which the title of that originally was Vivir Venecia. And obviously that's playing on an alliteration, Vivir Venecia. But living Venice just didn't work. And so in both the case of this book and Alberto Chimal's Los
yeah,
Esclavos, I chose first of all, Alberto said, I don't want to call it the slaves because of the connotation of slavery in the United States is very different than in Mexico. Uh,
yeah.
so I found lines from the books.
Okay.
So there is a line where it's talking about the man who's a slave to this rich young Mexican. He's forced to wear a little French maid costume and go around and dust things in the house. And the one part says he has to dust the most fragile objects. And then the A Long Day in Venice, that's also a line from the memoir. I think it's just kind of actually an accident uh, that I ended up doing. I've done 4 memoirs. So the first book by Pitol I translated was The Art of Flight, which is kind of actually this mixed genre. But it's memoir and it's also literary criticism, but it's very much memoir. Um, that's very different than translating fiction, because very often there's not as much figurative language. There's not as, I mean, there can be figurative language, but fiction, as I said earlier, is metaphor. It's the metaphorical language, the figurative language that makes fiction fiction. In the case of memoir, I mean, you can have what we call creative nonfiction. So the writing is creative, but you're essentially dealing with facts. It's not technically autobiography, because autobiography is much more involved in this happened on this date, and it tends to be just kind of neutral, right? And you are actually shaping, you're relying on your memory, right? You're not looking back to see what happened on this day or what happened on this day, although Pitol does look at his diaries. But you're much more interested in talking about why this happened or what effect it had on your life. Not the fact that it just happened, but how was this meaningful to my life at that moment? And now I'm looking back on it, and what do I remember about that moment? But still, you are dealing with facts. And so his trilogy of memory actually probably, and as you said, those are 3 books. Those actually required more research than I've ever done in my life. For example, I put footnotes in his trilogy of memory. I don't use footnotes in fiction, but since memoir is nonfiction, I will use footnotes to explain to my reader what's going on. And sometimes, because it does rely on memory, Pitol's memory sometimes failed him and he got things wrong. He may have gotten a date wrong. He may have gotten the title of it, because he talks a lot about his experiences with literature, beginning when he was a child. And he was bedridden for 2 years. He had malaria, and the only thing he could do was read. So he began reading voraciously as a child. Pitol's life is actually his life is told through his relationship with all of these works, these books that he read in multiple languages. And then Pitol went on to become a very prolific translator. I think he translated around 60 books. And he quoted freely. And sometimes he did his own translations, and he was kind of played fast and loose with his translations. But he would tell the reader what book maybe that the quote came from, but it wasn't like academic writing. He didn't put a footnote. So I would have to go through an entire book, because if for example, if he was quoting a text that was in English that he translated to Spanish, then I have to use the English. Or if he's quoting an Italian text or some other language that has already been translated, I can't translate from a translation. Right? So I also couldn't translate from the original language. So I would look to see if this book had already been translated into English, and then I would use the existing translation. But sometimes he wouldn't even tell you what book it came from. I'll give you one example of the links that I went to. I found out that one of the lines that he was using was from a very obscure book that I couldn't put my hands on. I actually had to
Mm.
buy a lot of these books. So I would either use Google Books, because sometimes you could find it, the whole book in Google Books, or
Yeah.
these other online resources, or I would go to Amazon where they have where you can view inside. But if I couldn't find the book online, I would buy them just to be able to find one quote. So I grew my own library incredibly. But once I couldn't even buy the book, but I found it in a library in a city where I knew someone. And I called a friend and said, go to the library, look for this book, look for this page,
Yeah.
write down what it says, and send it to me. Those are the links that I went to be able to translate his memoirs. Um, and I like doing that kind of stuff. I kind of look at it as like being a literary detective.
Yeah.
And I said in my translator's note to The Art of Flight, which is the first book I translated, that translating Pitol was like getting a PhD in literature,
Mm.
because I had to read things that I had never read before.
That's really beautiful. Could you talk about the process in general for translating a book? Like, how do you get
Well,
new projects?
I've been, I was actually very lucky when uh when I started translating Pitol, I had a 7-book contract. So
Ooh.
I didn't have to worry about finding anything to translate for 7 books. They just, and the majority of translators don't work that way. Um, so generally, you have to like what you're translating, right? So you want to find someone whose work that you like, whose work that you think is relevant, and whose work you think is going to be marketable. Because in the United States, as a rule, we have to find our own publishers. Uh,
Mm.
and you begin translating a book, and you're not paid until you find a publisher. So it's very possible to translate an entire book for free, and you're only
Mm.
going to make money if you can find a publisher who's willing to publish it. And that's how it is in the United States. But as I said before, you have to be aware of what the market is and what you think is going to be sellable in the United States. But you need to begin with what you like to read, right? Um, there are certain genres that I don't translate because I don't read them. And I
Mm.
don't translate, it's I don't translate science fiction, although I've translated some short stories that are pseudo science fiction by Alberto Chimal. But I haven't translated a novel that's science fiction because I don't read science fiction. So I don't know that language. It
Yeah.
it wouldn't sound convincing, right? Uh,
Mm.
so find stuff that you like. Horror is actually really big right now.
Mm.
Um, and that what's typically or traditionally was called genre fiction, right? So if you like to read horror, find a horror writer, right? And if you have students who want to translate from English to Spanish, right? The process is completely different, so I can't give you any advice on how to work with publishers, etc. But begin with translating someone that you like, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with that book. And if you don't
Yeah.
like it, so there's one thing about doing translation that you don't like, and you do it because it pays the bills, right? You know, okay, I've got this translation job. It's really boring, but it is what it is. Generally, when you're translating literature, that's not how you operate.
You and I once had a conversation about doing queer readings of literature and things like that, where the advice that you gave me was that to do a queer reading of something is or the definition you gave me is to go through and look at what's written and to see how it the status quo that's being written about destabilizes itself. Um, Taking that process over to translation and thinking about queer translation. You told me also about a conference that you went to. I think it was in Milwaukee. It was a literary translators conference. I don't remember all of the details, but there was a session on queer translation, and you were one of the few people there in the audience who is queer. And so you spoke up and, lent that perspective to the session. You can correct me and maybe fill in the details about that conference, but I wanted to ask, what is queer translation? And do you consider what you do to be queer translation?
Well, more properly, it's queering translation.
Okay.
So to queer something is actually a verb. And so you can queer translation. So what is queer? You talk about destabilizing. So what queering something is interested in doing is showing how gender and sexuality are actually unstable, and how the text actually shows its own, destabilizes itself. So what you do is you take
Mm,
the binaries of straight, gay, or male, female, right? And say, okay, these are presented normally as stable binaries, right? Well,
mm,
actually, and then everything is actually much less stable than we say it is. And that's much more, this thinking is much more common, this looking at gender fluidity or sexuality fluidity is much more common and prevalent today than it was. But when there was actually a field called queer studies, which began around 1989. So in the early 90s, this was actually very new. But what you did is you take a text and you try to show how it actually destabilizes itself, and says that no, these gender binaries and these sexuality binaries aren't as fixed as they seem to be. And how does the text actually show that, right?
mm,
Um, so when you so at the conference in Milwaukee, there were actually a lot of queer identifying people there, but there was really no so there was really no firm understanding about what it meant to queer a text. Okay, what does it mean to queer a translation? So
mm,
people were coming up with all of these ways that you can, in theory, do it. And I said, because I was the only person there, I'm 64 years old. I remember queer theory when it first came out, but
mm.
this room and panel were filled with lots of young queer people. And so what I
Okay.
said is, you need to go back to the origin of queer theory. So what you do is you, first of all, you analyze the text and show how the text undermines and destabilizes itself. And then you tease those out in your translation,
Mm,
right? Or you highlight them in your translation. So queer the text first, and then decide, what can I do in my translation to bring this to the forefront,
mm,
right? But there are subtle ways that you can queer a text. You can decide, for example, that you're always going to use the gender neutral they,
mm,
right? Um, and, for example, in Spanish now, you have people using stuff like queride instead of querido, or queridos, querides amigues, right? It's
mm,
very hard to do that in English, right? Because we don't rely so much on these morphemes, right, to show gender as much as Spanish does. Um, but you can just, one thing that I actually do, and I always tell this to my students, I always do this. If there's ever the word raro or extraño, I don't translate it as strange. I translate it as queer. Now, why do I do that? Because one of the meanings of queer is actually strange or unusual, but we tend
mm,
not to use it in that way. So if the text says something like, uh, fue un hombre, or era un hombre bastante raro or extraño, I'll say he was a rather queer man.
Hmm.
Uh, because I want the reader to be forced to have to deal with that word.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a very in your face way of dealing it. But there are more subtle ways. It's like, again, how am I going to foreground these issues in the text that are already querying themselves? How am I going to tease them out in the translation? I read an article recently. It was and I gave it to my students. It was in World Literature Today, and I'm happy to send it to you to give to your students.
That
But
would be great.
it's specifically ways that you can queer a text. And one of the ways is, for example, by playing with spelling, right? You can get really subversive, right? Because we think of queering something as also being subversive, right?
Hmm.
You can get subversive with spelling, right? So I'll send this to you so you can pass it along to your students.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. And I think the sentence too, when I think about the sentence, he was a very queer man, it does give the sense of just being strange there. It's interesting, like thinking about the political landscape in the United States right now, where like DEI has suddenly become a naughty word among uh, certain populations. And it's interesting because, words themselves are not controversial. It's just like a combination of letters. It's what human beings add to their interpretation of words that make them.
Right,
Uh, and so it's interesting that, a word like queer, many people wouldn't want to use it in the sense of strangeness. If you think about all the different definitions that a word can have, like we
right.
get into this we get into this habit of only using words in a single way. And so I think it's interesting too that that goes along with this approach that you're taking of showing people that the English language can do much more than maybe we believe it can do. Um, Thinking about sort of, well, I guess continuing with questions of identity as well, there was, I'm curious to get your opinion because back in 2021, Amanda Gorman, she had her inaugural poem. This ended up being translated. It was translated into Dutch by a non-binary translator who was white and a Black Dutch writer who isn't named in this NPR article that I'm eventually going to mention, called into question the fact that, maybe it would have been better to have a person who is Black, a person who has had experiences of racism and systemic discrimination and things like that actually do the translation. Have somebody who's also a spoken word uh, uh, poet do the translation. So this idea that somebody's identity should match with the identity of the author that they're translating in order for them to be able to do the translation. There was an article by NPR on this topic. The ATA reposted the article by NPR. Unfortunately, the article by NPR kind of took, well, not kind of, but it took a view of the situation that was really dismissive of the criticism that was happening, was dismissive of thinking about people's concerns about racial representation in translation. It was an article that oversimplified identity politics, excluded themes of racial justice. It didn't feature anyone speaking about the topic who was racialized as a Black person. It only featured Caucasian people speaking about the issues and saying that, no, it's perfectly fine that, a white person who's not a spoken language poet has translated this Black American spoken language poet. So ATA was criticized for being tone deaf by reposting that article at a race and linguistics panel that I attended in 2021. The panel was Black translators, Black localizers. I wonder what you think about that. Like, I wondered if there's female Mexican authors that you'd like to translate, and I wonder if you think that, like, when do you need to share the identity, not even gender identity, but when do you need to share the identity characteristics of the person you're translating in order to be able to have a authentic translation?
Well, believe it or not, we talked about this actually yesterday in my literary translation course.
Really?
It's a very complicated issue, and I'm not saying that to get out of, of responding to it. But it's a very nuanced, a nuanced situation that's hard to give the time that it deserves, right? And the attention and the seriousness it deserves. Um, the initial response and the response to NPR, and I'm aware of that column that NPR gave, was white people being offended, right? And I actually saw this play out I used to be on Twitter. I've since deleted my Twitter account, but your students can find me on Blue Sky and on Instagram. I've followed all of that, and I probably commented on it as well. But you had a lot of white and largely white male, and so it's the white male who's constantly feeling attacked, right? And so you had a lot of white male translators who otherwise might identify as being liberal or progressive, who really got their feelings hurt, right? And that's what it boils down to. And so it was this knee-jerk reaction. But going back to what we talked about earlier, there's this belief that anyone can translate anything. I'm good enough of a translator that I can translate anything, right? That's just simply not true. And I commented that there are things that I don't think I can translate. I think, and so Venuti actually has an article that I can send you as well that doesn't speak about this directly, but he talks about indirectly, and Randall, or what's his name? Oh my gosh, Russell Valentino talks about this in a blog post. Russell Valentino is a really well-known translator from, I think, Russian or other Slavic languages, teaches at the University of Indiana, and he's very prominent in Alta. He brings up this notion of what's called simpatico, right? Does the translator need to be simpatico, which means share some kind of affinity? Either identity is probably the most obvious form of affinity with the writer in order to be able to translate the writer. Then he references, no, he just says, if you want to know what Venuti has to say about simpatico, he's written about it a great deal. So I found an article that Venuti wrote, and he doesn't address this particular incident because I think the article was written before it, but he kind of dismantles this whole notion about simpatico being simpatico with the writer, and what does that mean? I think for me, what it boils down to is a question of whether or not someone can translate something, but can mean two things. Meaning do they have the ability, and do they have the right, right? So those are two different things. And I think people were kind of conflating them and getting lost. So first of all, I don't think that everyone can, meaning they have the ability to translate everything. Because for me, what is important is being able to find the voice, the author's voice. What is the author's voice? What are the characters' voices that are coming through? I could not translate something written in a dialect to 20-year-olds or even 30-year-olds. Elena, in her collection Tlaperia, has a short story about these about this girl who's is addicted to huffing glue on the
Mm.
street. So all these street children who are sniffing glue. That was very hard for me. One, I don't know a lot about that, so I had to do a lot of research. I mean, how do these people speak in English?
Mm.
That can I do justice to this? Could I translate something about a 20-year-old indigenous person from Panama? No, I couldn't. I don't know how those people speak. And
Yeah.
I don't know how to recreate it in English, right? But there's this belief, that white men are going to be white men. They think they know everything and I'm a white man, but I'm at least gay. So I come at this from a perspective of, to a certain extent, I am a minority, right? But white straight men, white cis gendered
Mm.
straight men think that they can do everything, right? Um, and it hurts their ego to say that you can't, because at the same time, they're saying what they're hearing is you don't have the ability to do it, which offends their sense of professionalism, and we're not going to let you do it, right?
Mm.
And so they feel attacked on two fronts there. Um, do I think that you have to share some identity category with someone in order to translate them? I think it helps. I think that you need to be aware of the limitations of your language. I know lots of language. I'm 64 years old. I've lived in many places. I've known people of all socioeconomic backgrounds, including
Yeah.
in family. I've traveled a lot. I've got a PhD. I have a lot of language at my disposal. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that I have all language at my disposal, right?
Mm.
Um, I looked back at the poem and I'm thinking, okay, what is there particularly in this poem that is reflective of the Black experience? Not a lot,
Mm.
right? That doesn't mean that, because other than this poem, there was a larger collection of poetry that was being translated. I wouldn't translate it because I do think you need to be a spoken word poet. I think
Mm.
there at the very minimum, right?
Yeah.
Because spoken word poetry is so specific, right? I have to be able to recreate that. I don't have the sensibility to recreate that genre. So let's start with that genre.
Yeah.
Then if there is something within that genre, within a particular piece that a white person absolutely cannot identify, because if you're asking a white person to recreate language that they did not grow up speaking, and by that I
Mm.
mean idiomatic language or dialectical language, right? I mean, if you don't want this poem to sound like it was written by a white man, you don't, or even a white woman. um
Yeah.
So I think there is a benefit to share, because there are multiple identity categories, and each person possesses multiple identity categories. The more overlap there is on the Venn diagram, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that gives the translator um, an advantage that other translators may not have. I think a lot of translators need to sit back and say, "Hey, I can't do this."
You know what I think gets drawn in there, is also this idea that translators are uh, windows into another culture. Translators are, I remember reading a paper in my translation theory class back when I was doing my master's that it really captured my attention at the time. I loved it. And it took me a really long time to realize the problems with the metaphor, but it talked about the translator being a chameleon. And it took me a really long time to realize like the metaphor of me as a white woman being able to change my skin color to like match the, like that's what it's saying. That's
Yeah,
what that
exactly.
metaphor is saying, is that
Exactly.
I can adopt the identity of a person from another culture and transparently convey uh, whatever it is that they have to say. And that's just, I mean, it's obviously very problematic. And so I
I'll,
think that's, yeah.
I'll give you a concrete example of something that I translated. A very long short story by a Cuban writer, Miguel Barnet. It was called Fatima o el Parque de la Fraternidad. This is a 10,000 word, essentially monologue. It was written in first person in one voice from start to finish. And the narrator protagonist was a drag queen in Cuba. Now, I'm gay. I was at one point in my life a drag queen. I know how drag queens speak. I know how they speak when they are with each other.
Mm,
Um, and this particular short story was translated by two people, me and a straight woman.
mm,
And I think my translation is better. Why do I think it's better? Because I know how drag queens talk,
yeah.
right? I don't think if you have not been around drag queens, if you've not listened to them, if you've not spoken with them, if you've not lived in that language, you don't know how to recreate that language. You don't know how to say things like, and all those bitches at Fraternity Park, right?
Mm,
Um, Even though the text in Spanish may not say bitches, right?
yeah.
I don't remember particularly because this has been a very long time what it says, but I know that that's the equivalent. That's what a drag queen would call these other drag queens, right?
Yeah.
Um, so if you don't know how drag queens talk, and just watching a few episodes or of Drupal's Drag Race isn't going to do it. And actually, it got translated and published before RuPaul's Drag Race. But my
Mm.
point there is, how is someone who's not been immersed in drag queen culture going to know what a drag queen sounds like?
I've been starting to talk about too, because we talk about subject matter experts a lot. I think we need to talk more about in culture experts, because when you bring subject matter experts into it, there is this idea that, I mean, and obviously for certain types of text, you want a subject matter expert. For like scientific, technical, you want somebody who knows the subject of the content they're translating. I think subject matter expert is also a term that could be used to refer to somebody who's a cultural expert, but it doesn't acknowledge the cultural
Right.
piece to it enough.
No, those are very analogous because I teach students how to translate within domains that I'm not a subject matter expert in, but I know how to do the research to be able to do the translation. What I tell my students is every subject has its own language.
Hmm.
There's a way economists speak, and not just referring to terminology, right? There are
Yeah.
terms of phrase. There is an economics language. There's a scientific language. There is a legal language. And if you're not used to dealing, living,
Hmm.
working in that language, you can tell that this was not translated by a subject matter expert,
Yeah.
right? The same thing is true culturally. So
Hmm.
I was, to some extent, a subject matter expert in drag queen language, right?
Yeah.
And you can extrapolate that to say that I am a subject matter expert in spoken word poetry, which I'm not, but I think I would need to be. So being
Mm,
able to, literary translators, and I'd love that you brought this up because I think the analogy is perfect, but I don't think literary translators think of it in these terms.
mm,
You need to be a subject matter expert to work within this cultural context.
yeah,
Cultural meaning, not only referring to being country specific, right, but also being language specific and being identity specific as well.
exactly. What attracts you to Mexican literature?
I think because I first went to Mexico when I was 15, believe it or not. And I've been to Mexico dozens of times. I mean, I don't even know how many times. Um, and I started reading Mexican literature in high school. I
Mm,
took 4 years of Spanish in high school. I was very good. And so somewhere around Spanish 3 or 4, you actually start reading poems and short stories. And then I did my undergraduate degree in Spanish and I read more Mexican literature. And Mexico, in the 20th century had some very, very important writers. And so, we had to read the canon, right? Um, and so I read a lot. I read more Latin American or Spanish or Mexican literature than I did. I know more about Mexican literature than I do about American literature, for example.
mm.
And then in graduate school, the same thing. I think because I have such a fondness for the country, right? And I appreciate the richness of the culture, but also, I mean, specifically its literary culture. I mean, there's a lot of important literature that came out of Mexico.
Mm.
Um, and I think it's good if a literary translator has a country or a genre or a period that they like translating because I think that makes the translation better.
What advice would you have for people who are interested in getting into literary translation? And specifically, if we think about this statistic that you gave earlier of, 3% of the literary market in the United States is goes to translations. Do you see that learning literary translation, for example, opens the door to um, complementary types of translation, or what advice would you give for folks who are interested in this?
Well, I really can't give any advice for anyone who's wanting to translate and publish within Mexico because I don't know how that system works. I do know that Mexico has a literary translation association. So, and I don't know the name of it, but the first thing I would do is to seek it out
Okay.
and become a member if you can. Usually they have, reduced rates for students. Um, and start talking, attend any panels that you possibly can. Now there's so many panels that are being done via Zoom. It's so easy to attend these things.
Yeah.
Um, you know, Alberto Chimal and his wife Raquel Castro, and she's a writer on her own. She does a lot of children's and young adult translation, uh, novels. Um, they have a weekly podcast on YouTube.
Ah, cool.
And they're both just absolutely wonderful people. They just lost their two cats within a week of each other. Their cats,
Ah,
it's like were their children, Purgas and Morris. Uh,
mm,
but look for Alberto Chimal and Raquel Castro on YouTube. And I think it's
yeah.
Tuesdays, but it's a live cast. So you can type in questions and stuff like that. And they have a very extensive website where you can find all kinds of stuff. Um, so find writers that you like and develop a relationship with them. Find out who some of the Mexican translators are, who is translating, because actually 3% is in the United States. Mexico and other countries, the percentage of translated literature is much higher.
Mm.
Um, So there's a lot of particularly American literature that is being translated in Mexico. Um, so seek out translators, right? I wish I had more concrete
I think that's
advice to
great
give.
advice. I think that's great advice. Are there any thoughts you'd like to close with?
Other than I really have to run because speaking of our pet children, I have a dog. I have a 9-year-old Havanese. His name is Henry People that I have to go let out. But
Yeah,
this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Your students are very lucky to have you. I hope they realize that.
well,
Um,
likewise for your students too.
well, thank you. And feel free to share my email with them if you
I
like.
will. Yep.
Uh, I'm trying to decide whether it would be best to share my work email or my personal email. I don't know which one I avoid most. I probably avoid my work email the most. But any help that
I'll
I
look
can
you up on
give
Blue
you.
Sky and give them that, or
Okay,
on
and
Instagram. Yeah.
Instagram. But
Yeah.
actually, as I tell my students, and if they're on X, I just deleted my account because I don't like Elon Musk. Um, those can be wonderful networking. And you can use them for you find a community of translators, right? And
Yeah.
follow them, right? And that way you figure out what's going on and you find out about all these opportunities. So that's use social media for something other than social media.
George, thank you so much. I always learn so much when we talk to each other. It feels like I'm getting a private lesson every time we have a conversation, a private lesson in translation. Thank you so much for your willingness to share your time and your expertise today. And yeah, we look forward to catching up with you again sometime soon.
Thank you. I had
Bye.
a lot of fun.
I did too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.